There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no name in any language I know. It is not the loneliness of being alone in a room. It is the loneliness of sitting at a dinner table surrounded by your own children, watching them pass dishes over your head and speak about you in the third person while you are still sitting right there. She had another episode this morning. The doctor said we should think seriously about the next steps. It's getting harder to manage. I am Margaret Elaine Osei. I am 73 years old. I was a senior lecturer in constitutional law at the University of Bristol for 22 years. I have argued cases in front of panels that would make most people sweat through their shirts. I have written 2 textbooks that are still used in law faculties across the United Kingdom and 3 Commonwealth countries. I speak 4 languages, including conversational Twi, because my late husband Kofi was from Kumasi and I refused to let our children grow up without understanding where half of them came from. I do not have dementia. I have never had dementia. But for 6 months, I let my children believe that I did. I played the role they had written for me with a precision and a patience that I am, frankly, rather proud of. I shuffled when I walked. I repeated myself at dinner. I forgot names I knew perfectly well. I stared out windows with a carefully practiced vacancy. I let them talk about me as though I were a piece of furniture that had started to wobble. And while I performed that role, I was doing something else entirely. I was building a case. This is the story of how I went from being the woman my children were quietly trying to erase to being the woman who made sure they faced every consequence they had earned. It is also the story of how I discovered that the most dangerous thing in the world is an old woman who has decided to stop being polite. Let me take you back to where it began. The call that started everything. My daughter Adiz called me on a Wednesday evening in early February. She has a particular tone she uses when she has decided something and wants me to feel as though I have been included in the decision. I recognized it when she was 17 and wanted to switch her A-level subjects without telling her father. She uses the same tone now that she is 44 and sits on the board of a private equity firm in London. "Mum," she said, "we've been talking. All of us. Me and Daniel and Kofi Jr. Daniel is my eldest at 47. He runs a construction consultancy in Birmingham. Kofi Jr., we always called him KJ to avoid confusion with his father, is 39 and works in pharmaceutical sales in Edinburgh. All 3 of them had apparently been having conversations about me without me, which is not a new development but had recently acquired a frequency that I found troubling. We think, Adiz continued, that you should consider moving somewhere with more support. I was sitting in my kitchen and bath, drinking a cup of rooibos tea and reading a rather good biography of Shirley Chisholm. My kitchen is immaculate. My garden, which I tend myself, won 3 prizes from the Somerset Horticultural Society last summer. I had driven myself to the GP 2 weeks prior for my annual checkup and been told my blood pressure was the blood pressure of a woman 15 years younger. I had also, the previous Thursday, spent 4 hours advising a former student who was preparing testimony for a parliamentary select committee. More support, I repeated. You've been forgetting things, Mum. You left the hob on last month. I had left the hob on. Once. Because I was in the middle of an urgent phone call with a colleague in Cape Town and I was distracted. I am reasonably certain that every adult in England has left a hob on at some point in their lives. I'm perfectly fine, I said. We just think a second opinion would help. Put all our minds at rest. My GP has put her mind at rest. My mind is at rest. Mum. The tone again. Patient. Gentle. Immovable. We've already made an appointment with a specialist. Next Tuesday. Daniel will drive you. I should have pushed back harder. I know that now. But I was not yet alarmed. I thought they were being overcautious children, anxious and loving and slightly overbearing, which is not an unusual combination in adult offspring who live far away from an aging parent. I agreed to the appointment. I had nothing to hide. The specialist, a Dr. Fairweather in Bristol, was a pleasant enough man with an unfortunate tie. He asked me a series of questions. He showed me pictures and asked me to name them. He gave me words to remember and asked me to repeat them 20 minutes later. He drew a clock face and asked me to draw one too. I answered everything correctly. I drew an excellent clock. Dr. Fairweather looked at me carefully and said I appeared cognitively sharp, that there were no immediate concerns, and that he would recommend a follow-up in 12 months as a standard precaution for someone my age. He handed me a leaflet about brain health in older adults. I felt vindicated. I took the leaflet home and read it on the drive back, while Daniel sat in the front seat making phone calls. But something about that day nagged at me. Daniel had asked to speak to Dr. Fairweather privately, without me, for about 10 minutes, before my appointment. He said he wanted to give the doctor some background. I had waited in the reception area, reading a magazine about narrowboats. I thought nothing of it at the time. 2 weeks later, I found out what he had said. The letter I was not meant to read. My cleaner, a wonderful Zimbabwean woman named Blessing who has worked for me for 11 years, found a piece of paper that had slipped behind the radiator in my hallway. She brought it to me without ceremony, as she brings me everything, with absolute directness and a complete absence of drama. It was a printed email, forwarded between Daniel and Adiz. It was a summary of a conversation they had held with Dr. Fairweather. Not the official appointment. A follow-up call they had made to his office 3 days later, which I had known nothing about. Daniel had told Dr. Fairweather that I had been experiencing significant episodes of confusion, that I had forgotten the names of my grandchildren on multiple occasions, that I had been found wandering in the garden at night in my dressing gown, and that I had twice left the front door standing open when I went to bed. None of this was true. Not a single word of it. Dr. Fairweather, based on this fabricated history provided by my son, had noted in the follow-up that the patient's presentation in the clinical setting may not be fully representative and that family observations are an important part of cognitive assessment and that he would update his notes accordingly. I sat in my living room for a very long time after reading that letter. I thought about what Daniel and Adiz were doing. I thought about KJ, who had been quieter in our recent calls but had not corrected anything his siblings said. I thought about my house, which I own outright, paid off the mortgage on 11 years ago, and which is currently valued, according to the estate agent who had sent me an unsolicited appraisal last autumn, at £840,000. I thought about my investment portfolio, which my late husband and I had built over 40 years and which currently generates a comfortable income. I thought about my will, which had not been updated since Kofi died 6 years ago. And then I thought about a woman I had read about in a legal journal 18 months earlier. An elderly woman in Nottingham whose children had had her declared mentally incapacitated through a combination of false testimony, a compliant GP, and a rushed court order. They had assumed power of attorney and liquidated her savings within 8 months. By the time a social worker raised a flag, the money was gone and the woman was in a care facility she had never chosen. I am a constitutional lawyer. I know exactly how that process works. I understood, sitting in my living room with that printed email in my hands, that my children were not being overcautious. They were building a case. They were laying groundwork. They were constructing a narrative about a woman losing her faculties so that, at the appropriate moment, they could step in and manage what she left behind, while she was still alive to watch them do it. I put the letter back where Blessing had found it. I went into my study. I closed the door. And I began to plan. The decision to play along. The most important decision I made in those first days was the decision not to confront them. I am by nature a confrontational person. I believe in directness. I believe in naming things accurately. My instinct was to call Daniel immediately and read the contents of that email to him, slowly, and then explain in precise legal terms what the consequences of continuing down that road would be. I did not do this. I did not do it because I understood that confrontation, at that moment, would hand them exactly what they needed. If I called Daniel angry and frightened, he would tell Dr. Fairweather that I had become agitated and paranoid. If I threatened legal action, he would document it as evidence of disordered thinking. Everything I did in my own defense would be reframed as a symptom of the very condition they were inventing. I needed evidence. Real evidence. A paper trail that no doctor's amended notes could contradict. But first, I needed to give them enough rope. I called my solicitor that week. Not my children's solicitor, not the firm that had done our family's conveyancing for 30 years. My own solicitor, a woman named Patricia Kamau, whom I had met at a legal conference in Edinburgh in 2019 and who runs a private practice specializing in elder law and estate protection. I told Patricia everything. I told her about the letter, about the fabricated episodes, about my concerns regarding my assets. I asked her what the strongest position I could be in was, legally, before I moved against them. Document everything, Patricia said. Cognitive assessments, ideally independent ones. Bank records showing your own management of your finances. Any communications where they misrepresent your condition. And Margaret, don't tip them off. I have no intention of tipping them off, I said. Good. Because the moment they know you're aware, they'll accelerate. I took a comprehensive cognitive assessment with a neuropsychologist in London named Dr. Amara Sewell, whom Patricia recommended. I told no one about the appointment. I drove myself to London, spent 4 hours being tested across every dimension of cognitive function, and returned home with a report that described my performance as exceptional and placed me in the 92nd percentile for my age group. I put the report in a fireproof safe I had installed in my study the previous spring. Then I began to pretend. 6 months of performance. I want to be clear about something. What I did over the following 6 months was not easy. It required a kind of sustained self-discipline that I had not called upon since the years when I was managing a full teaching load, raising 3 children, and caring for Kofi during the final 18 months of his illness. It required me to diminish myself, deliberately and daily, in the presence of people who were watching me closely for evidence of diminishment. I started small. At Sunday dinner at Adi's house in Guildford, she hosts once a month, which I normally find exhausting but now found operationally useful, I repeated the same anecdote about a former student twice in one meal. Not obviously. Not so frequently that it looked staged. Just once, with slightly different wording the second time, as though I had momentarily lost the thread of what I had already said. Adi's caught Daniel's eye across the table. I saw it. I kept talking. Over the following weeks, I introduced small confusions. I called KJ's wife Priya by the name of his previous girlfriend, Sandra, twice, an error I chose carefully because it was plausible given that KJ had dated Sandra for 4 years and Priya and he had only married 3 years ago. I left the television on when I went to bed on 2 occasions when I knew Adiz was staying with me. I once, when Daniel called to check in, referred to a legal case I was advising on as though I had forgotten its outcome, even though I had attended the hearing personally the previous month. None of these were dramatic. None were the sort of spectacular confusion that appears in films. They were the small, quiet erosions that are actually far more convincing, to people who want to see them, than any Hollywood rendering of cognitive decline. The children responded exactly as I expected. The calls became more frequent. Daniel started asking whether I had been eating regularly. Adiz began sending food packages, nutritious, expensive, and completely unnecessary. KJ started calling every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock with the regularity of a man who had set a reminder on his phone, which I was fairly certain he had. They came to Bath in groups now, not alone. Someone was always checking. And while they checked, I was documenting everything. What they were really doing. I had asked Blessing, who is one of the most observant people I have ever met, to let me know if anyone contacted her about my condition or behavior. She agreed without asking why. 3 weeks later, she told me that Adiz had called her and asked her, a woman who has known me for 11 years, who cleans my home twice a week, who has sat at my kitchen table and eaten my jollof rice and told me about her children in Harare, to report back if she noticed anything concerning. Blessing had told Adiz, with characteristic economy, that she had noticed nothing concerning. She then told me about the call, verbatim, and I wrote it down. I also learned, through a contact at the Bristol Land Registry who owed me a professional favor, that Daniel had made an inquiry about the process for registering a lasting power of attorney. The inquiry was preliminary and informal, but it had been made. I wrote that down too. In April, 2 months into my performance, Adiz brought a man named Gerald to Sunday dinner. She introduced him as a family friend with a practice in health and social care consultancy. Gerald asked me several questions during dinner that I recognized immediately as informal cognitive screening, questions about recent news events, about the month and year, about sequences of numbers. I answered some correctly and some not quite, and I watched Gerald make small notes on his phone under the table. After dinner, when I was supposedly resting in the living room, I listened through the open door as Adiz asked Gerald for his impression. Gerald said I showed signs of what he called functional decline, which is a phrase that means almost nothing diagnostically but sounds authoritative to people who want to hear it. He recommended a formal assessment, which Adiz said they were working toward. I wrote all of this down. Names, dates, times, precise words spoken. In May, Adiz sat me down during one of her visits and, with the expression of a person delivering terrible news, told me that they had been speaking to a solicitor, a different one from mine, a man named Howard Pierce, about setting up a lasting power of attorney to make sure things are taken care of properly. She framed it as a gift, as love, as practical kindness. She said it would give everyone peace of mind. I held my teacup in both hands. I let my eyes go slightly unfocused, which I had practiced. I said, "That sounds sensible, darling." Adiz reached over and patted my hand. Inside, I was perfectly still. The stillness of a person who knows exactly what is coming next. The solicitor's meeting. The meeting with Howard Pierce took place on the 12th of June at his office in Guildford. Daniel and Adiz drove me there. KJ attended by telephone. They had not told me the full purpose of the meeting, describing it only as paperwork. I sat in the chair they chose for me, in a pale blue cardigan they had suggested I wear because it made me look, in Adiz's words, comfortable. Howard Pierce was a man of about 55, brisk and not unkind, with the manner of someone who has had this conversation many times. He explained the nature of a lasting power of attorney. He explained the two types, one for property and financial affairs, one for health and welfare. He explained that, with my agreement, my children would be able to make decisions on my behalf if I were ever unable to do so. With my agreement, I repeated. Yes, he said carefully. It's important that you understand and consent to this arrangement. I nodded slowly, as though processing a great deal of information at once. I asked him to repeat several things. I asked whether this meant my children could sell my house. He said that a financial LPA could give them authority over property if it became necessary. And my investments? I said. Yes, those too, if you granted that authority. Daniel cleared his throat and said, gently, that this was simply about making sure I was protected. I looked at Howard Pierce. I looked at my hands. I said, in the voice of a slightly confused and slightly frightened elderly woman, that I supposed it made sense if they all thought it was for the best. Howard Pierce said he would prepare the documents for my review. In the car on the way home, Adiz held my hand and told me I had been very brave. I looked out the window. The countryside near Guildford is quite pretty in June. The fields were a particular shade of pale green that reminded me of Kofi's grandmother's compound in Kumasi, where we had spent 2 months the summer after we were married, before the children came and the world contracted to the size of a semi-detached house in Bristol. I thought about Kofi. I thought about what he would have said about all of this. He was a gentle man, my husband, but he had a precision about injustice that was ferocious once it was activated. I thought, not yet. But soon. The things nobody tells you about being watched. There is a particular quality to being surveilled by people who love you. It is not the cold surveillance of strangers. It has warmth in it, which makes it more disorienting, not less. I noticed it in small things first. The way Daniel, when he visited in March, opened the fridge without asking and checked its contents with a casualness that was not casual at all, a quick inventory, conducted under the guise of looking for milk. The way Adiz started accompanying me to the post office on her visits, which I had never asked her to do and which I found, in the beginning, merely slightly irritating before I understood what it meant. The way KJ asked, on every call, whether I had seen anyone recently, a friend, a neighbor, anyone, in a tone that was designed to determine whether I was isolated rather than to express interest in my social life. They were looking for evidence. They were hoping not to find it, perhaps, in the way that people who construct a story sometimes hope, belatedly, that reality will not cooperate. But they were looking. And so I gave it to them. The precision required for this kind of sustained performance is not something I would have expected to find in myself. I am a direct person by nature and by professional habit. 30 years in law and academia had made indirectness feel physically uncomfortable, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet. But I found, in those 6 months, a capacity for patience and performance that I think must have been there all along, dormant, waiting for circumstances that made it necessary. I kept a private log. Every evening, in a notebook I kept locked in my briefcase, old habits from my practicing years, I wrote the date, the name of whoever I had spoken to or seen that day, and a precise account of anything I had performed, said, or noticed. The log was not emotionally written. It was factual in the manner of case notes. What I had done. What response it had produced. What I observed. Reading it back now, in the months after everything resolved, I am struck by how much of those 6 months was devoted not to performing confusion but to managing the emotional cost of it. The entries are factually dry, but between the lines of them I can read what I was actually experiencing. The specific quality of sitting at Adiz's dinner table and watching my daughter explain to her husband, within earshot, that she was keeping an eye on things, and knowing that the thing being kept an eye on was me. The specific quality of answering KJ's Sunday evening calls with a carefully modulated vagueness that left him reassured about his own narrative and left me, every time, with a tiredness that had nothing to do with the hour. I want to name this honestly because I think it is important. The performance was strategic and correct, and I would do it again without hesitation. It was also a sustained act of self-diminishment carried out in the presence of my own children, and it cost something real. I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for accuracy. Those who find themselves in similar situations, who read this and recognize something of their own experience in mine, should know that the difficulty of it does not mean they are doing it wrong. The visit that changed my understanding. In late April, approximately 10 weeks into my performance, something happened that fundamentally revised my understanding of what I was dealing with. Adiz came to Bath on what she described as a spontaneous weekend visit, though I had not believed it was spontaneous from the first moment she mentioned it. She arrived on a Friday evening and we had a perfectly pleasant dinner. I made groundnut soup, Kofi's mother's recipe, which she has always loved. Saturday morning she went to a yoga class she had found near the city center. Saturday afternoon she said she wanted to run a couple of errands in town and would I like to come. I said yes. I wore my slightly confused expression, which I had refined to a quality that was just present enough to be noticed without being so theatrical as to seem performed. We walked through the center of Bath. Adiz took us, without apparent deliberation, past the offices of a care home management company I recognized from its signage on a building I had walked past for years but never had reason to enter. She said, casually, that she had read about them, that someone at work had mentioned they did excellent facilities in the Southwest, that it might be worth knowing about them for the future. I said, in my vague voice, that they looked nice. She did not suggest we go in. We walked on. We had coffee. The conversation moved to other things. But on the Monday after she left, I walked back to that building alone, at my normal pace, with my real face. I looked up the company online that evening. They operated 8 care homes across Somerset, Wiltshire, and Dorset. Their facilities were, by most available reviews, adequate to good. Their fees ranged from £3,500 to £5,200 per month, depending on the level of care required. £5,200 per month. £62,400 per year. Against the value of my Bath property, my investment portfolio, the pension income one receive, this was not an inconceivable sum. But it would reduce my liquid assets meaningfully. And the question of who would manage those assets, were I to be in residential care and deemed unable to do so myself, was precisely the question that a registered LPA would be designed to answer. I am a constitutional lawyer. I know how to read a structure. I added the care home company to my notes. I noted the date of Adi's visit and the route she had taken and the address of the building and the timing of the visit relative to the conversation at Howard Pierce's office. I noted that she had not mentioned the company either before or after that Saturday afternoon, which meant she had wanted me to see it without wanting to appear to have shown it to me. I called Patricia that evening and told her what I had observed. Patricia was quiet for a moment and then said, "Margaret, I think we need to establish the full financial picture before we move. I want to understand what they think they're looking at." We spent the next 3 weeks doing exactly that. My estate, at the time of these events, comprised the following. My Bath property, valued at £840,000. An investment portfolio, managed by a firm I had been with for 15 years, with a current value of approximately £412,000. A defined benefit pension that I have drawn since retiring from the university, which provides a comfortable monthly income. A smaller personal pension, the remains of private contributions made during my years in legal practice, worth approximately £90,000. A current account and a savings account with balances that are nobody's business but mine and my bank's. Total net worth, in the region of £1.4 million. More, arguably, if one accounts for investment growth over the period of a care home stay of, say, 5 to 7 years, which is a normal planning horizon in these matters. To people in financial difficulty, and I now knew that Daniel, Adiz, and KJ were each, in different ways, in financial difficulty, the prospect of being beneficiaries of an estate of this size, sooner rather than later, is not nothing. I do not say this to be cruel. I say it because it is the truth, and because understanding it accurately is important both for my own situation and for anyone reading this who is trying to understand why loving people do things that are not loving. Money creates pressure. Pressure creates distorted thinking. Distorted thinking creates stories that serve the pressure. The story my children had constructed, that their mother was declining, that she needed managing, that the most loving and responsible thing was to formalize control before things got worse, was, I believe, genuinely felt by at least some of them, at least some of the time. This does not make it true or acceptable. But it makes it human, which is the complication that estrangement cannot resolve. Patricia, having reviewed the full financial picture, advised me that the most important protective step, beyond the LPA defense, was the revision of my will and the restructuring of my liquid assets. If they can't get control while you're alive, she said, they'll position for control when you're not. The will needs to be bulletproof. It was. Patricia made sure of it. The moment I decided it was time. The event that ended my patience happened on a Thursday afternoon in late July. I received a call from my bank. Not from the branch I use in Bath, but from the fraud and financial protection team at the bank's head office. A customer service representative named Nadia told me, with careful professionalism, that a third party had contacted the bank claiming to be acting on my behalf and had requested detailed information about my account balances, standing orders, and investment holdings linked to the account. The third party had identified themselves as my son, Daniel Osei. Daniel did not have authority to request that information. Not yet. The LPA documents had not been signed, had not been registered with the Office of the Public Guardian, and had not been granted any legal force whatsoever. Daniel had called my bank and asked for my financial details as though he already had authority he did not possess. The bank had declined the request and called me as a matter of protocol. I thanked Nadia. I asked her to note the call and the request on my account. I asked her to send me a written confirmation. She said she would. I sat at my kitchen table after the call and felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. Something that felt like the moment in a courtroom when you know you have won and it is simply a matter of proceeding to the end. I picked up my phone and called Patricia. It's time, I said. Tell me everything, she said. Building the case. Over the next 3 weeks, Patricia and I assembled what she later described as one of the cleanest elder financial exploitation cases she had seen in 15 years of practice. We had the cognitive assessment from Dr. Sewell in London, conducted 3 months before the Pierce meeting, showing unambiguous cognitive health. We had my own documented record of every episode I had performed, with dates and contextual notes, which I had been maintaining in an encrypted folder on my laptop since February. We had the printed email Blessing had found, the account of Gerald's dinner table screening, the recording, which I had made legally on my phone, having checked the relevant legislation, of the conversation in which Adiz described Gerald as a family friend while clearly deploying him as an assessor. We had Blessing's written account, which she gave voluntarily and without any prompting from me, of Adiz's request that she report on my behavior. We had the bank's written confirmation of Daniel's unauthorized inquiry into my accounts. We had Patricia's own file notes of our very first conversation in February, establishing the timeline. We also had something I had not anticipated finding, which Patricia had unearthed through her own inquiries, evidence that Howard Pierce had registered an LPA on behalf of an elderly client 2 years previously, in circumstances that a subsequent review by the Office of the Public Guardian had found irregular. The review had not led to formal censure, but it had been noted. Patricia filed a formal complaint with the Solicitors Regulation Authority and asked them to review the Pierce file in connection with our matter. Then I called Dr. Fairweather's office. I did not call as a patient. I called as a solicitor's client, with Patricia on the line, and I asked the practice manager to pull the notes from my February appointment and any subsequent amendments. I advised them that I was aware of the private call that had taken place 3 days after my appointment between the practice and members of my family, that I had documentation of the false information provided during that call, and that I intended to raise a formal complaint with the General Medical Council regarding the amendment of clinical notes on the basis of uncorroborated family testimony. The practice manager put me on hold for 6 minutes. When she came back, she asked if I would be willing to attend a meeting with Dr. Fairweather in person, at my convenience. I said I would. Patricia attended with me. I brought the cognitive assessment from Dr. Sewell. I brought my own documented timeline. I brought 3 specific references to guidance from the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence regarding the weight given to family testimony in cognitive assessments and the safeguards that should surround any amendment of clinical records. Dr. Fairweather, to his credit, went quite pale. He acknowledged that his notes had been amended on the basis of information he had not independently verified. He acknowledged that he had not asked me, his patient, to respond to or verify the concerns raised in the family's follow-up call. He agreed to restore his original assessment notes and to add a formal notation that the amended entry had been based on unverified third-party information. He also, unprompted, offered to provide a written statement regarding the circumstances of the note amendment, which Patricia accepted on my behalf with professional courtesy. We walked out of that surgery and I breathed the summer air of Bristol and felt extraordinarily alive. Confronting the truth about my children. It is one thing to know your children are capable of something. It is another to see the full architecture of it. In early August, Patricia's investigative contacts, she works with a small firm of financial investigators who specialize in elder abuse cases, turned up information that recontextualized everything I thought I understood about my children's motives. Daniel's construction consultancy, I learned, had significant debt. Not the ordinary operational debt of a small business, but structural debt acquired over 3 years of overextension on projects that had not returned what he had projected. He was servicing approximately £340,000 of business loans against revenues that had declined for 2 consecutive years. He had not told me. He had never asked me for help. But his bank records, obtained legally through the investigators' channels, showed that over the past 18 months he had made 3 separate requests to his own bank for refinancing, all declined. Adiz, whose private equity career I had understood to be highly successful, had in fact been passed over for partnership at her firm the previous autumn. This I had not known. She had mentioned nothing. But the investigators found a tribunal claim she had filed against the firm, alleging gender discrimination, which had been settled confidentially 3 months ago. The settlement amount was not large. Her income, while still substantial, was considerably less than I had assumed. KJ, my youngest, the quietest, the one I had always thought was simply following his siblings, had borrowed money twice in the past 4 years. Once from a colleague, once from his mother-in-law. Both loans were outstanding. He and Priya had a child coming in November. My children were not greedy in the uncomplicated, cartoonish way. They were frightened. They were under pressure that they had concealed from me with the same pride that I had, I realized, modeled to them for decades, the Osei family pride that does not admit financial difficulty because financial difficulty is something that happens to other people. This understanding did not make what they were doing forgivable. But it made it comprehensible, which is a different thing. I also learned something that turned comprehension back into fury. Adiz had spoken to an estate agent in September of the previous year, 6 months before they had first raised concerns about my cognition, and had asked for a valuation of my Bath property. She had described herself as representing a potential seller and had not mentioned that she was my daughter or that I was alive and well and had no intention of selling anything. The estate agent's record of that inquiry, obtained by the investigators, was dated 4 months before the fabricated episodes Daniel had described to Dr. Fairweather. They had not noticed a decline and responded to it. They had planned a narrative and recruited a decline to support it. I added every page of the investigator's report to my fireproof safe. Then I called Patricia and told her I was ready to move. The LPA that never was. The LPA documents that Howard Pierce had prepared were sent to me in mid-August for review and signature. They were accompanied by a letter from Pierce that was careful and correct in its language, explaining my right to take independent legal advice before signing. I did not sign them. I sent them to Patricia, who reviewed them and identified 3 clauses that she described as unusually broad in the discretionary authority they granted my children over investment decisions. She wrote to Pierce's office detailing the concerns. Pierce's response was, in her professional assessment, evasive. Patricia filed her complaint with the Solicitor's Regulation Authority. I updated my will. The new will, drafted with Patricia's assistance, was precise and protected against exactly the kind of challenge that might arise from someone claiming I had been of diminished capacity when I executed it. It included a recital, a formal written statement at the beginning of the document, confirming my capacity, referencing Dr. Sewell's cognitive assessment, and documenting that the will had been drafted in full knowledge of the attempts to establish a false narrative of cognitive decline. It left my estate, the Bath property, the investments, everything, in a discretionary trust for my grandchildren, with Patricia named as one of the trustees alongside my niece Comfort, who lives in Toronto and has nothing to do with any of this and whom I trust entirely. Daniel and Adiz and KJ were not excluded. They were beneficiaries of the trust. But they were not trustees, and they could not access or direct the assets. The trust would provide for my grandchildren's education and welfare, and would eventually pass to the grandchildren themselves when the youngest reached 25. I had also, 2 weeks before this, opened a new current account and savings account in my name alone at a different bank, and transferred the majority of my liquid assets there. The existing account, the one Daniel had inquired about, I left active with a modest balance. On the 23rd of August, I called Daniel. I used my normal voice. My real voice. Daniel, I said, I need you to come to Bath on Saturday. Adiz and KJ as well. I need to speak to all 3 of you. He heard something in my tone and paused. Is everything all right, Mum? Saturday, I said. 2 o'clock. The conversation. They arrived together. This told me Daniel had called the others immediately after I rang off and they had coordinated. They were wearing the careful, gentle expressions of people who have rehearsed something. Adiz had brought flowers. KJ had brought a tin of shortbread from a Scottish bakery, the kind he always brings when he wants to signal peacefulness. I had arranged the living room deliberately. For chairs equidistant, no soft sofa that might make anyone feel settled. Tea on the table, already poured. Patricia was not present in person, but she was available by phone and had helped me prepare. I sat down. They sat down. Adiz put the flowers on the mantelpiece, which I did not acknowledge. I'm going to speak, I said, and I'd like you to listen. When I've finished, you can say whatever you need to say. I spoke for 22 minutes. I know because I had timed my preparation. I told them what I knew about Daniel's call to the bank. I told them what I knew about Adiz's visit to the estate agent. I told them what I knew about the email Blessing had found, about Gerald at dinner, about the call to Dr. Fairweather's office with fabricated testimony, about the LPA documents with their unusually broad clauses. I told them about Dr. Sewell's cognitive assessment. I put a copy of it on the table. I told them about my new will. I told them about the new bank accounts. I told them about Patricia. I told them about the complaint to the Solicitors Regulation Authority. I did not raise my voice once. When I finished, the room was absolutely silent. Adiz was crying, which I noted without sentimentality. Daniel was looking at a point on the carpet somewhere to the left of my feet. KJ was looking at me with an expression that, in another context, I would have called remorse. The episodes, KJ said finally. The forgetting. The hub. Yes, I said. You were. Yes. Another silence. Mum, Daniel said, and his voice had lost all its rehearsed gentleness and come down into something raw and undefended that I recognized from when he was a boy. I don't know what to say to you. I know, I said. That's what I expected. I told them 3 things. First, the LPA process was over. I would not be granting any of them financial or welfare authority over me, now or in the future. If I reached a point where I genuinely required such support, it would be managed by Patricia and Comfort and a professional deputy, not by my children. Second, Daniel's unauthorized bank inquiry and the false testimony provided to Dr. Fairweather were both matters I could pursue legally. I had chosen not to pursue them at this time. That choice would remain intact as long as no further actions were taken against my financial or personal autonomy. If they were, I would reconsider that choice. Third, I loved them. I had always loved them. I was their mother and that was not something I could turn off, even sitting in this room, even knowing what they had planned. But I would not allow love to be weaponized against me. They had confused my generosity for weakness and my silence for ignorance, and both of those confusions were now corrected. I picked up my tea and drank some of it. You can eat the shortbread if you like, I said to KJ. I won't be having any. There was a long silence. Adiz had stopped crying and was now looking at the middle distance with an expression I had seen on her face in courtrooms, years ago, when she attended one of my lectures and then sat through a moot competition afterward. It was the face of someone recalibrating against new information. Daniel said, finally, I need to understand something. The doctor's notes. You said they were amended. On the basis of information you provided, I said. A private call to the surgery, 3 days after my appointment, during which you described episodes of confusion that had not occurred. I described what I had seen. I looked at him. Daniel. You described me wandering in my garden at night in my dressing gown. You described me forgetting my grandchildren's names on multiple occasions. You described me leaving my front door open when I went to bed. Not one of those things happened. Not once. He did not argue. This told me that some part of him had known, or had chosen not to examine, the distance between concern and fabrication. The question, I said, is not whether you were frightened for me. I believe you were frightened. The question is whether your fear entitled you to alter clinical records, consult an estate agent about my property without my knowledge, or instruct a solicitor to draw up documents designed to give you authority over my financial affairs before those affairs had given you any cause for such authority. The answer to that question is no. It was always no. Adiz said, quietly, we thought we were protecting you. I know, I said. That is the part that troubles me most. Not that you did this with conscious malice, but that you did it with love, and still managed to cause the harm that malice would have caused. This is, I think, the most important sentence I have ever spoken to my children. I have said a great many important things to them over the years, at their births, at their father's funeral, at moments of difficulty and celebration across nearly 5 decades. But this one matters in a particular way, because it names the mechanism. The harm caused by loving people who have confused protection with control is not lesser harm. It is the same harm. It simply has a different accompanying expression on the face of the person causing it. The weeks that followed. The days after that conversation were not comfortable. Nothing so fundamental rearranges itself without discomfort. Daniel called me twice in the following week. The first call was defensive, still trying to reframe his actions as concern. I listened for about 4 minutes and then said I would speak to him again when he had had more time to think. The second call was different. He was quieter. He talked about the business debt for the first time, told me numbers he had been hiding for 3 years. He cried, which Daniel has not done in front of me since he was 11 years old and his hamster died. I listened to all of it. I did not apologize for anything I had done. But I listened. Adi sent a letter, handwritten, which surprised me. 5 pages. She wrote about the partnership she had lost, about the settlement, about a fear I had not known she carried, a deep, specific fear of ending up financially dependent on a man, any man, because of something that had happened to her mother-in-law in Lagos years before Adi's had any reason to connect it to herself. The fear was real, I thought, even if what she had done with it was not justified. I read the letter twice and put it away. KJ came to Bath alone on a Saturday, without calling ahead, which is unlike him. He rang the doorbell. When I opened the door he said, I didn't know it had gone this far. I want you to know I didn't know about the estate agent or the doctor's notes. I should have asked more questions and I didn't. He came in. We had lunch. We talked for 4 hours. I believe him about what he didn't know, because KJ has never been able to lie to my face in 40 years and I would know. I did not rebuild everything. What had been built over decades had been broken, and things that are broken take longer to repair than the break takes to cause. But I was not interested in being estranged from my children forever. I was interested in being treated honestly. Those are different objectives, and I held them both simultaneously. The complaint to the SRA regarding Howard Pierce's office resulted in a formal investigation. I was not the only person who had filed concerns, there were 2 other complaints on the file. Howard Pierce was eventually found to have failed in his duty to ensure that clients were free from undue influence when executing LPA documents. He received a formal rebuke and was required to undertake training. He did not lose his license. I did not feel strongly either way about his license. I had not filed the complaint to punish him. I had filed it because the investigation might protect someone whose family was less equipped than mine to mount a defense. Dr. Fairweather's restored notes were reflected in my GP record. He did not face formal GMC proceedings. I chose not to escalate, on the basis that he had corrected the record and cooperated fully. I was also mindful that escalation would cost me time and energy that I had better uses for. In September, Patricia introduced me to a colleague of hers, a barrister named Funk Adeyemi, who works with Age UK and a number of other organizations on elder financial abuse cases. Funk had been watching what Patricia called the Osei pattern, the false cognitive narrative constructed to justify LPA, and was interested in whether I would be willing to speak publicly about my experience. I told her I needed to think about it. While I thought, I started paying attention to things I had not paid attention to before. A woman in my garden club, Lois, whose son had moved her into sheltered accommodation the previous year and then converted her house, which she had also owned outright, into rental property in which Lois received no share. A neighbor of Blessing's sister, a man of 78 whose daughter had power of attorney and who had recently had his monthly income halved by a financial management plan she had implemented without his knowledge. A former colleague of mine from the university, a man I had known for decades, whose children were engaged in a legal dispute over his estate while he was still living, still teaching, still fully present in every possible sense. This is not rare. I want to be direct about that, because I think it is tempting to read stories like mine as exceptional, as extreme, as something that happens to other people. It is not rare. It happens in well-furnished living rooms and carefully worded solicitors' letters and dinner tables where adult children exchange glances over the heads of their parents. It happens to smart people. It happens to people with legal training. It happens to people who have spent their lives being the most capable person in any room. It happens precisely to those people, in fact, because those people are often the least likely to be believed when they say something has gone wrong. I said yes to funk. What striking actually looks like. I want to address the word struck in the title, because I think there is a temptation to imagine a dramatic moment, a confrontation in a solicitor's office, a door slamming, money changing hands in a decisive reversal. That is not quite what happened, or rather, it is not the full picture of what happened. Striking, when you are a 73-year-old woman who has spent 6 months being underestimated, does not look like a single blow. It looks like the systematic, methodical dismantling of every assumption that was made about you. It looks like a new will, and a new bank, and a cognitive assessment, and a solicitor's complaint, and a corrected GP record, and a 4-hour conversation with your youngest child that is more honest than anything you have said to each other in years. It looks like the transformation of 6 months of humiliation into 6 months of evidence. The most satisfying moment, if I am being honest, was not the conversation with my children. It was not the bank call, or the SRA complaint, or the restored GP notes. It was the morning in late August when I sat in my study, in the house that is mine and has always been mine, and I wrote a full account of everything that had happened and sent it to Patricia with a note that said, "I think we're done with the defensive phase." What's next? What was next was building something. The story goes public. In October, I gave an interview to a journalist named Priya Desai who writes for a broadsheet that I have read for most of my adult life. Priya had been connected to me through Funk and had been working on a long-form piece about elder financial abuse in middle-class families, specifically the phenomenon of adult children constructing false cognitive narratives to establish control over parents who are, in fact, entirely capable. The interview was published in November. It ran to 3,000 words and included, with my permission, specific details about the false testimony provided to Dr. Fairweather, the estate agent inquiry, the bank call, and the LPA process. My name was used. My children were not named but were described in general terms. My solicitor had reviewed everything for legal safety before publication. The response was remarkable. Not in the sense that it changed policy overnight. Nothing changes policy overnight, but in the sense that the volume and nature of the responses revealed the scale of something I had only partially understood. Within a fortnight of publication, Funk's organization had received 43 contacts from people who recognized their own situations and mine. Not all of them were as far along in the process as I had been. Some were at the very beginning, the gentle suggestion of a specialist appointment, the first mention of a power of attorney, and had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. Some were much further in, dealing with LPAs that had already been registered, assets that had already moved. I spoke to as many of them as I could. Not as a lawyer, I am retired from practice, and the jurisdictional complications of advising individual strangers are real, but as someone who had been where they were and knew the landscape. I referred everyone to Funk's organization and to Patricia's network of elder law solicitors. The calls did not stop. My relationship with my children is not what it was before February. I do not think it will ever be what it was before February, and I am not certain I would want it to be. What it was before February was a relationship built on a foundation I had not examined, the assumption that love and loyalty were the same thing, that proximity guaranteed protection, that being someone's mother was itself sufficient collateral against being treated as something to be managed. I know better now. Daniel and I have reached something I would describe as a working honesty. His business debt is no longer a secret, and we have had several direct conversations about it, conversations in which I did not offer to solve the problem and he did not ask me to. He is working through it. He found a financial advisor who restructured 2 of the loans and is helping him set realistic revenue targets for the next 3 years. He called me in January to say that one of his major clients had renewed their contract for a further 2 years, and he sounded, for the first time in years, like a man who was standing on ground he had built himself. He has not apologized in so many words. I am not certain I need him to. What I need is the thing I have, a son who no longer treats me as a problem to be solved or a resource to be managed. A son who calls me when things go wrong and tells me the truth. Adiz has surprised me the most. She is, in many ways, my most complicated child, the one most like me, which is probably the source of much of our difficulty. After the 5-page letter, she went quiet for several weeks. Then she started calling, not with the careful gentleness she had deployed during the months of the scheme, but with her real voice, sharp and funny and occasionally impatient and far more interesting than the version she had been presenting. We had a long argument in March about something entirely unrelated to any of this, and it was the best conversation I had had with her in years, because we were actually disagreeing rather than performing agreement for each other's benefit. She told me in April that she had started her own independent advisory practice, 2 days a week alongside her main role, specializing in corporate governance for family-owned businesses. She said, without quite meeting my eyes, that she had been thinking about control structures and what makes them legitimate, and that she thought she had something useful to say about it. I told her I thought she probably did. KJ and Priya had their baby in November, a girl, which surprised everyone, because KJ has always been convinced he would produce nothing but boys. They named her Abina Margaret, which is both a Ghanaian name and my name, and which I found more moving than I had expected to find anything. Abina has dark eyes and a quality of alertness that her grandmother recognizes. I am not sentimental enough to believe that a baby's name repairs everything. But I am wise enough to recognize a gesture when I see one. What the house means now. The Bath property is still mine. It will remain mine for as long as I choose to live in it. I have made some changes. I had a small annex built at the bottom of the garden, a single room with its own bathroom and kitchen, properly permitted and architecturally sympathetic to the original house. Blessing's youngest daughter, who is studying nursing at Bath Spa University and needed affordable accommodation near the campus, lives there in exchange for very modest rent. Her presence means someone is nearby if anything genuinely goes wrong. More than that, her presence is simply pleasant. She is a serious young woman with excellent opinions about television drama and a way of laughing that fills the whole garden. I also had the study reorganized. For years it was a memorial as much as a workspace, Kofi's books still on the shelves exactly where he had left them, his reading chair in the corner, the photograph on the wall of the 2 of us at the Victoria Falls in 1994, the year Adiz was born, and we somehow still managed a holiday. I have not removed any of it. But I have added to it. My cognitive assessment from Dr. Sewell is framed and on the wall, which is perhaps eccentric, but I find it satisfying. Next to it is the letter from the SRA confirming that Pierce's office had been investigated. Next to that is a copy of Priya Desai's article. I am not a person who needs reminders of her victories. But I am a person who has come to understand the value of bearing witness to her own life. The advocacy work. In the spring of the following year, Funk and I co-wrote a policy paper for Age UK calling for stronger safeguards in the LPA registration process, specifically around the independent verification of the subject's mental capacity and the requirement for clinical assessments that are not reliant solely on family testimony. We called for mandatory independent GP involvement in any LPA application where family members had initiated the process rather than the subject themselves. The paper was submitted to the Department of Health and Social Care. It was also submitted as evidence to a parliamentary inquiry into elder financial abuse that had been announced following coverage of several high-profile cases in the press. Funk testified before the inquiry. I did not testify, by choice. I thought the policy argument was stronger without my personal case at its center, but my written evidence was included in the inquiry's report. The inquiry made 11 recommendations. As of the time of writing, 4 of them have been adopted by the government in revised guidance to the Office of the Public Guardian. The mandatory independent assessment recommendation was not among them. We continue to push for it. This is how change happens. Not in a single decisive moment but in the accumulation of arguments, evidence, conversations, and refusals to be quiet. I know this from law. I know this from 30 years of teaching people how systems change and why they resist change and what it takes to move them anyway. I am patient. I have learned, in the last 2 years, a quality of patience I did not know I possessed. On forgiveness and what it means. People ask me, journalists, people who have read the article, people who meet me at the events Funk organizes, whether I have forgiven my children. The question is well-intentioned and I try to receive it as such. I find the word imprecise. Forgiveness implies a transaction, an offense committed, a penalty discharged, a ledger returned to zero. That is not how I experience the situation. What I have done is something more complex than forgiving and more useful. I have understood. I understand that Daniel was terrified and that his terror expressed itself in a plan that was dishonest and wrong. I understand that Adie's complicated feelings about financial dependence and professional standing led her to a place she would not have reached if she had talked to me honestly. I understand that KJ did not fully know what was happening and that his failure was one of asking too few questions, not of designing harm. Understanding is not the same as excusing. They did something that could have had serious consequences for my life. If I had been less equipped, legally, financially, temperamentally, those consequences would have materialized. Other people, with less access to Patricia and Dr. Sewell and Funk and years of legal training, have faced those consequences without the resources to fight back. The fact that I could fight back does not make what they did acceptable. It makes me fortunate. Those are different things. What I have decided, with deliberateness and clarity, is to remain in relationship with my children while holding full and unambiguous understanding of what they attempted. This is not naive. It is chosen. There is a significant difference. On playing the role. The 6 months of pretending are something I return to in thought more than any other part of this experience. I return to them not with regret, the strategy was correct and I would do it again, but with a complex awareness of what it cost and what it revealed. It cost me something to diminish myself, even strategically. To repeat yourself at a dinner table, to let your eyes go vacant, to allow your children to pat your hand and explain things to you that you understood before they were born, there is a specific texture of indignity to this that is not erased by knowing it is temporary and purposeful. I knew, on every occasion, exactly what I was doing and why. I also knew, on every occasion, that the performance was based on a real thing, that this is what happens to some women, that the vacancy I was performing is something some people genuinely inhabit, and that those people are surrounded by the same careful voices and sympathetic expressions and practical conversations about their futures. The performance revealed something about the distance between how I see myself and how I was seen. I had understood myself as formidable. As someone who could not be managed. And yet my children had managed me, or attempted to, with a facility that suggested they did not share my understanding of my own formidableness. That gap is instructive. It tells me something about aging and visibility and the specific way in which older women become, in the imagination of people who love them, a category before they are a person. I am still, at 73, more person than category. I intend to remain so. Abina Margaret and what comes next. My granddaughter Abina Margaret is 14 months old now. She has discovered walking and approaches it with the confidence of someone who has decided that falling is simply part of the process and nothing to get upset about. She visited Bath last month with KJ and Priya and spent 40 minutes in my garden eating soil, which I attempted to discourage and Priya attempted to photograph. I thought, watching her in the garden, about what I want for her. Not specifically, she is 14 months old and her preferences are currently centered on soil and the cat next door and a specific yellow cup that she will accept no substitutes for. I mean broadly, structurally. What I want the world to offer her as she grows into it. I want a world in which her intelligence is not something that needs to be verified against other people's doubts. I want a world in which her age, when she reaches mine, is not automatically registered as vulnerability. I want a world in which the people who love her are not permitted to construct a narrative about her without her participation and then act on that narrative with legal and financial force. That world does not exist yet. I am working on it. In the meantime, I am teaching myself bookbinding. This is something I have wanted to do for years and never found time for when I was teaching, raising children, caring for Kofi, practicing law in consultancy, managing grief. I take a class on Tuesday afternoons at a workshop in Bath run by a man named Ola who came from Lagos in 1991 and has been binding books in this city for 30 years and who is one of the most precisely skilled people I have ever watched work. I have made 3 books. They are imperfect. The spine on the second one has a slight lean that I notice every time I look at it. Ola says the lean is character. I am choosing to believe him. What the inquiry heard. I want to tell you what the parliamentary inquiry heard, because I think it matters beyond my particular situation. The inquiry into elder financial abuse in England and Wales, which ran across 11 months and heard evidence from more than 60 witnesses, found the following. Approximately 1 in 6 older adults in the United Kingdom will experience some form of financial abuse in their lifetime. Of those, a majority of cases involve family members as the perpetrators. Most cases are never reported. Of those that are reported, a significant proportion involve the prior construction of a narrative of cognitive incapacity, a false or exaggerated account of the older person's mental decline used to justify the acquisition of legal or practical control over their affairs. The inquiry found that the existing LPA registration process, overseen by the Office of the Public Guardian, relied too heavily on self-reporting by the applicant and too little on independent clinical verification. It found that the provision allowing any person to notify the OPG of concerns about undue influence was underused, in part because most older people did not know it existed and in part because the threshold for investigation was set too high. It found that general practitioners, who are often the first point of contact in questions of cognitive capacity, received inadequate training on elder financial abuse, the role they play in its facilitation when clinical notes are amended on the basis of unverified family testimony, and the safeguards they should deploy when family members make representations about a patient's condition in the absence of the patient. It found, quoting directly from my written evidence, that the assumption that family concern is synonymous with patient welfare is one of the most dangerous assumptions embedded in the current system. I am proud of that sentence. I spent some time on it. The 4 recommendations that have been implemented require, among other things, that the OPG provide clearer information to all LPA applicants about the notification process, that care home operators take additional steps to verify that placements are voluntary and not the result of coercion, and that a new online resource be created to help older adults understand their rights in relation to power of attorney. These are not enough. They are something. Funk and I continue to push for mandatory independent clinical assessment in all LPA applications initiated by family members. We have the support of 3 major charities, 2 academic research centers, and 1 very persistent former senior lecturer in constitutional law who has, it turns out, a good deal more time on her hands than she expected. The letters I received. The response to Priya Desai's article produced correspondence that I did not anticipate either in its volume or its nature. I expected some. I expected the sympathetic notes from people who had read the piece and found it resonant in a general sense, the solidarity of strangers who share an age demographic and a set of anxieties. I received those, and I appreciated them. What I did not expect was the specificity. The detail. The precision with which dozens of people described situations that mapped, in their essential structure, onto mine. A woman in Newcastle whose son had moved her into sheltered housing while she was recovering from a hip replacement, without her knowledge that the move was permanent, and had subsequently rented her house to tenants whose rent he collected. A man in Exeter whose daughter had registered an LPA during a period of genuine but temporary confusion following surgery and had not sought to have it reviewed when he recovered. A woman in Cardiff who had been told by her GP, acting on information provided by her son during a consultation she had not attended, that she appeared to be experiencing early cognitive changes and who had been living with this note on her medical record for 18 months without ever having had a direct cognitive assessment. Each of these letters was a specific weight. I read them all. I responded to as many as I could, always pointing to resources and professional contacts rather than attempting to advise. But the reading itself was important. It is too easy, having successfully navigated a difficult situation, to privatize the experience, to treat it as a personal story, a family story, something that happened to me specifically because of the specific people involved. The letters made that privatization impossible. These were not exceptional situations. They were ordinary ones. They were what happens when a system that is meant to protect older people is, in practice, more easily used against them than for them, because the people who design systems are rarely thinking about the people those systems fail. I kept the letters in a folder. I referred to them when I felt, in the quiet moments of advocacy work, that the arguments were abstract. They are not abstract. They have addresses and postmarks and the particular handwriting of people who sat down to write to a stranger because they needed someone to tell. On growing older with clarity. I turned 74 in December. The birthday was, for the first time in several years, straightforwardly pleasant. Daniel organized it, which surprised me. He booked a room at a restaurant in Bath that I have always liked but never managed to go to because it requires advance reservation and I am not, in general, a person who plans celebrations for myself. He arranged for KJ and Priya and Abina to come down from Edinburgh, and for Adiz to come from London, and for my niece Comfort to fly in from Toronto, which she had been threatening to do for 2 years and which finally happened. He had contacted the restaurant and told them I preferred Ghanaian music at a quiet volume, which they had somehow managed to arrange through a playlist. I sat at the table with the people I love most in the world, most of whom had, at some point in the preceding 2 years, caused me serious difficulty, and I thought about what it means to remain in relationship with people who have shown you their worst. It means that you do not pretend the worst did not happen. You carry it in your full knowledge of who they are. You love them from that knowledge, not in ignorance of it, which is a more demanding form of love than the ignorant kind but also, I think, a more real one. Kofi used to say, and this is a thing I have returned to many times, that the people who disappoint you most are usually the people you understood least. The disappointment is the education. This is not consoling in the moment. But in the longer view, which age gives you access to in ways that youth cannot, it is accurate. I gave a very short speech. I thanked Daniel for organizing. I looked around the table at all of them, my children, my granddaughter, my niece, and I said that I had learned, over the past 2 years, to distinguish between the love that seeks to manage and the love that seeks to know. I said I was grateful to be in a room full of people who were, at least tonight, attempting the latter. Adiz laughed, which was not the response I expected, and then covered her mouth, and then said, "Mum, that is the most law lecture thing anyone has ever said at a birthday dinner." And everyone laughed, including me, which is the best possible use of a birthday in my experience. The notebook. There is a specific object I want to tell you about before I close this account. The notebook. The locked one, from my briefcase, in which I kept the log of 6 months of performed confusion. I have it still. It sits in the fireproof safe with Dr. Sewell's assessment and the SRA letter and the other documents from this period. I take it out occasionally, not often, but occasionally, and read through the entries. They read now like field notes from a very strange expedition. The dates and the performances and the responses, all in my handwriting, all in the dry factual register I used to protect myself from the emotional content of what I was documenting. March 17th. Daniel visited. Repeated question about heating twice during conversation. He noted it and did not correct me. April 4th. Adiz dinner. Referred to Priya as Sandra twice. Adiz exchanged look with Daniel. Third look this visit. Reading them, I am aware of the woman who wrote those entries. She is me and she is also, in some sense, the other woman, the performed one, the shuffling one, the one with the carefully practiced vacancy. She is the character I played in order to preserve myself, which is an extraordinary thing to have done and which I am still not entirely sure how to feel about. I think I will keep the notebook. It is, among other things, a record of precision. Of the fact that I was there, fully present, throughout every moment of a period when my children believed I was partially absent. There is something in that, a claim on my own experience that nobody can dispute, because I documented it myself, in my own hand, in locked pages, for no audience but the eventual truth. This is what I know, 74 years into a life that has included considerably more than I anticipated when I was young. You do not stop being yourself simply because other people have decided to describe you differently. The description and the reality are not the same thing. The description can be very loud and come from people who love you and be delivered with complete conviction and still be wrong. Still be a story someone else wrote about you, for their own reasons, in your absence. You are under no obligation to perform the character they have written. The last thing they got wrong. There is one final miscalculation I have not yet named, and I want to name it, because I think it is the most revealing. My children assumed, in constructing their plan, that what I feared most was being alone. That the threat implicit in their management of me, the removal of my independence, the transfer of control, was something I would ultimately accept in order to preserve closeness to them and to my grandchildren. They had watched me for 47 years as a woman who organized her life around the people in it, who had subordinated aspects of her career to Kofi's career when the children were young, who had moved from Bristol to Bath rather than following a position at a London institution, who had visited Daniel in Birmingham and Adiz in Guildford and KJ in Edinburgh on their schedules more often than on mine. They had mistaken accommodation for need. They had looked at a woman who made choices in favor of her family and concluded that she could not live without them, rather than that she had chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, to live with them. This is a different thing. The choosing is the thing. A woman who has chosen to orient her life toward the people she loves is not the same as a woman who would collapse without them. She is, in fact, often the opposite, a woman who understands what she values clearly enough to make sustained choices in its favor, which requires a self-possession, a knowledge of her own preferences, that the people being chosen for often do not fully see. I do not need my children. I love them. I have chosen them over and over, for nearly 5 decades. These are not the same statement. The confusion between them was, in the end, the mistake that undid the plan entirely. Because a woman who needs you can be managed. A woman who is chosen you can also choose otherwise. They found out which one I was. I think they understand it now. In the honest version of our relationship that has emerged from all of this, there is, when the conversation goes deep enough, a quality of recognition that was not there before. Daniel said something to me in January that I think about often. He said, "I think I've spent my whole life not quite knowing who you are. I'm sorry it took something like this to start." I told him that knowing someone takes a long time and that 47 years was not a bad start. He laughed. He has a good laugh, Daniel. He always has. What I want you to know. Before I close this account, I want to speak directly to the people I think are most likely to need it. If you are reading this and you recognize something of your own situation and mine, the gentle suggestions about specialists, the conversations held in your presence that treat you as absent, the quiet maneuverings around your property and your finances, I want you to understand a number of things. The first is that you are probably not imagining it. When something feels wrong, when the texture of your family's concern begins to feel less like love and more like management, that feeling deserves to be taken seriously. The people around you may be convinced that what they are doing is for your benefit. Their conviction does not make it true. The second is that you have more time than you think, provided you act before the legal structures are in place. Once a lasting power of attorney is registered and activated, reversing it requires a formal application to the Court of Protection, which is possible but slow and costly and difficult. Before that point, your options are considerably wider. The window in which to act is earlier than most people realize. The third is that an independent solicitor, not a family solicitor, not anyone who has any existing relationship with the people you are concerned about, is the most important single resource you can access. The Law Society has a directory of solicitors specializing in elder law. Age UK can provide referrals. Patricia Kamau and the network of practitioners she is connected to exist precisely for situations like mine, and the initial consultation, in most cases, is at fixed cost or free. The fourth is that an independent cognitive assessment, conducted by a neuropsychologist of your choosing rather than anyone recommended by family members, is a document of enormous protective value. It is a factual record, made before any dispute reaches legal proceedings, of your cognitive state at a specific moment. It cannot easily be argued away. Get one, even if you feel certain you do not need it. You probably do not need it. But the certainty of your own knowledge and the documented record of a clinical professional are two different instruments, and both are worth having. The fifth is the most important: do not tip your hand before you are ready. The moment the people around you know that you are aware and actively resisting, the pace of their actions will increase. Use whatever time you have quietly. Document first. Consult your solicitor first. Protect your assets first. Then act. You are not, I promise you, as alone in this as they are counting on you to be. The garden, the books, and getting started. There is a specific morning, a Tuesday in February, exactly 2 years after Adi's first call, when I understood that I had completed something. Not finished. That is a different word. I do not think any of this is finished. The relationship work with my children continues. The advocacy work continues. The legal framework I want to change has not yet changed. Priya Desai has asked me to write something longer than an interview, a book possibly, which I am considering with a mixture of interest and caution because writing a book requires a particular kind of sustained honesty that makes legal work seem straightforward by comparison. What I had completed was the thing that began in February 2 years ago, the project of returning to myself. Of being, without apology or performance or management, the woman I have always been. I was in the study on that February Tuesday, reading a new paper on cognitive reserve and its relationship to lifelong intellectual engagement, a paper that argues, with considerable evidence, that people who maintain mentally demanding work into older age show measurably stronger resilience to cognitive decline. I read it with interest. I made notes in the margin, which I have always done. I disagreed with one of the methodology sections and wrote a fairly emphatic rebuttal in the margin, which no one will ever read but which is entirely satisfying to have written. I poured a cup of rooibos. I looked at the garden, which is still winning prizes and which Abina will dig up when she is old enough to reach it. I looked at the framed cognitive assessment on the wall. I thought about Nadia from the bank's fraud team, and how I had felt the thing settle inside me when she called, and how that settling had been the beginning of everything that came after. I thought about the 6 months of shuffling and repetition and carefully practiced vacancy, and how exhausting they had been, and how completely worth it. I thought about Kofi, who would have had a great deal to say about all of this. He was a quiet man, but his silence was not passive. He watched the world with an accuracy that still informs how I see things, even 6 years after his death. I think he would have been, in this instance, first furious and then proud. I think he would have read every page of Patricia's file and asked good questions about the parts that interested him. I think he would have found the moment with Dr. Fairweather particularly satisfying, because Kofi had a great deal of respect for medical professionals and a corresponding intolerance for those who failed the standards of their own profession. I have lived long enough to watch the cultural conversation about older women cycle through several iterations. There is the version that celebrates us, wraps us in the language of wisdom and resilience and the silver-haired freedom of lives fully lived. There is the version that pities us, that sees fragility in every white hair and limitation in every year added to the count. There is the version that, as I have discovered, erases us, that decides, on the basis of age and a certain stillness that is sometimes mistaken for vacancy, that we are done with the project of ourselves and ready to be managed. None of these versions is me. I suspect none of them is most of the women I know who share my approximate age and circumstance. We are, most of us, considerably more complicated than any of the available versions allows for. We are people with full interior lives and specific opinions and projects we have not yet completed and things we are still trying to understand. We are people who contain, simultaneously, genuine limitation and extraordinary capacity, and who navigate the two without constant reference to how either looks from the outside. The trap my children built was constructed from the assumption that the outside view, the view that sees a 73-year-old widow living alone in a large house and registers primarily the vulnerability of that picture, was the full and accurate picture. It was not. The inside of that picture contained a former constitutional lawyer with a fireproof safe, a precise solicitor, an independent cognitive assessment, a cleaning lady with excellent observation skills, and 6 months of meticulous documentation. They built the trap. I walked through it to the other side. The garden needs attention in March, the hellebores will need dividing, and the front bed needs rethinking after last summer's drought left the soil compacted in ways that will not resolve themselves without intervention. Abina will visit at Easter. The parliamentary inquiry's remaining recommendations need someone to continue pushing for them, and that someone might as well be me. Ola is teaching me a more complex binding technique next month, a Japanese stab binding that requires a different kind of patience than the Western styles I have been learning, and which I am approaching with the mixture of humility and determination that I have found serves me well in new endeavors. The house is mine. The garden is mine. The study with its framed documents and Kofi's books and the slightly leaning second bookbinding notebook is mine. The granddaughter with the dark eyes and the appetite for garden soil is mine, in the sense that matters, the sense of love freely given to someone who did not choose you and cannot yet name you and will, if everything goes as I intend, grow up knowing who you actually were. Patricia sent me a card last month, for no occasion in particular. It said, "To the most organized opponent I have ever worked with. Continued thanks for making my practice considerably more interesting." I have it pinned above my desk, next to the framed cognitive assessment and the SRA letter and Priya's article. The most organized opponent. Yes. I think that is probably right. I am 74 years old. My mind is as sharp as the morning I woke up and decided I was done being managed. My hands work. My garden grows. I am just getting started. If you or someone you know may be experiencing financial exploitation by family members, or if you are concerned that a loved one's cognitive capacity has been misrepresented in a legal or medical context, please contact Age UK's advice line or seek an independent elder law solicitor. You do not have to accept the narrative that others have written for you. And if you are the one they have underestimated, document everything. Find your Patricia. Do not tip your hand before you are ready. You are not as alone as they are counting on you to be.